We are often told that history is shaped by great battles, but in the summer of 1462, the fate of empires was decided not by the clash of steel, but by the silence of the dead. Imagine a forest, yet the trees are not made of timber. They are 20,000 human bodies rotting in the heat, arranged in precise geometric rows. This was not the act of a madman. It was the calculated strategy of a genius who weaponized absolute terror to bring the most powerful army on earth to its knees. This is the true story of Vlad the Impaler. Forget the vampire myths, for the reality of what happened in those woods is far more terrifying. If you have the stomach to confront the darkest corners of the human mind, subscribe now. And before we begin, tell me in the comments, from which city are you watching this descent into darkness? To understand the monsters, we must first look upon the boy. It is a fundamental error of historians to assume that Vlad III was born with ice in his veins. In truth, the coldness was taught lesson by painful lesson. The year is 1442. The location is the windswept borders of the Ottoman Empire. A father, Vlad the Dracula, makes a pact that no parent should ever have to conceive. To preserve his own fragile crown in Wallachia, he trades his own flesh and blood. Two young boys, Vlad, aged 11, and his younger brother Radu, aged 7, are handed over to Sultan Murad II as living collateral. They are not thrown into a dungeon, which would have been a kindness. Instead, they are taken to the fortress of Egrigos, and later to the opulent court of the Sultan. Here, amidst the scent of jasmine and the soft rustle of silk, young Vlad enters a prison disguised as a paradise, while his younger brother Radu, a boy of soft temperament and undeniable beauty, quickly succumbed to the seduction of the Ottoman court. Befriending the future Sultan Mehmed and adopting their customs, Vlad remained rigid. He was a creature of defiance. The contemporary chronicles tell us that while Radu was praised, Vlad was disciplined, but do not imagine a simple beating. In the Ottoman court of the 15th century, discipline was a refined art form. It was during these 6 agonizing years, formational years, that bridged the gap between childhood and manhood, that Vlad's psychology was dismantled and reassembled. He watched. He observed with the unblinking intensity of a predator how the Ottomans managed an empire that spanned continents. He learned that mercy was a luxury that rulers could not afford. He witnessed public executions, not merely as acts of punishment, but as acts of theater. He saw how the agony of one man, if displayed with sufficient creativity, could ensure the silence and obedience of thousands. This was his education. He did not study the sword as much as he studied the psychology of fear. He realized that for a small nation like Wallachia to survive between the crushing weight of the Hungarian kingdom and the Ottoman Empire, honor was useless. Terror was an equalizer. In 1448, the Ottomans released him. They believed they had broken him, or perhaps that they had sufficiently indoctrinated him to be a puppet prince. They were gravely mistaken. They had not trained a puppet, they had sharpened a blade, and now they were sending it home. But the home that awaited him was a graveyard. Upon his return to Wallachia, the young prince found his world reduced to ash. His father had been assassinated, a victim of the treacherous boyars, the feudal nobility who changed allegiances as easily as they changed their cloaks. But it was the fate of his older brother, Mirsha, that would ignite the dormant powder keg within Vlad's soul. Mirsha had not simply been killed. According to the harrowing accounts of the time, he had been captured by the merchants and nobles of Targovishte. They had blinded him with hot irons, and then, while the breath still rattled in his lungs, they had buried him alive. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine the darkness. Imagine the sensory horror of waking up in the crushing embrace of the earth. The soil filling your mouth as you scream for a god who does not answer. This was the trauma that greeted Vlad. He was 17 years old. He was alone, and he was surrounded by the very men who had murdered his family. A lesser man would have fled. A rational man would have sought diplomatic compromise. But Vlad, infected by the brutal logic of his Ottoman upbringing, did not want compromise. He wanted a reckoning. He understood that the boyars viewed him as nothing more than another temporary inconvenience, a transient prince to be used and discarded. To survive, he would have to show them a face of authority so terrible, so utterly devoid of human hesitation, that the very thought of treason would freeze in their veins. For years he waited. He played the game of politics, enduring exile, forging alliances until 1456. In the year he finally seized the throne firmly, the year the dragon uncoiled. He invited the boyars to a feast to celebrate Easter. It was to be a reconciliation, or so they thought. But as the wine flowed and the laughter echoed off the stone walls of the banquet hall, Vlad sat in silence, watching the necks of the men who had buried his brother. He was not looking at guests. He was looking at structural foundation for his new world. The doors to the banquet hall were bolted shut. The music died, replaced by the heavy rhythmic thud of armored boots. Vlad stood before the assembled nobility, the cream of Wallachia society. 500 of them, draped in velvet and silk, their fingers heavy with gold rings. He asked them a question that cut through the silence like a whip. "How many princes have you survived?" The answers came with a tone of aristocratic arrogance. 7, said one. 12, boasted another. They were proud of their longevity. They were proud that they had outlived ruler after ruler, manipulating the throne from the shadows. They did not realize that they were confessing to treason. At a signal from the prince, the guards descended. The elderly, those too frail to work, were impaled on the spot beyond the city walls. But for the young, the strong, and their wives, Vlad had designed a punishment far more exquisite than simple execution. He stripped them of their finery and marched them north, 50 miles through rugged, unforgiving terrain to the ruins of Poenari. This is where the sensory horror of Vlad's reign truly begins to manifest. He did not just kill them, he used them for months. These nobles, men and women who had never lifted anything heavier than a goblet of wine, were forced to haul stones up a sheer mountainside to rebuild his fortress. We have accounts that describe the degradation in vivid detail. Their clothes rotted off their bodies, leaving them naked under the lashing rain and the burning sun. Their skin blistered and peeled. The mortar used to bind the stones of Poenari Castle was mixed, quite literally, with the blood and the crumbling bones of the Wallachian aristocracy. When you look at the ruins of Poenari today, perched high on that cliff, you are not looking at a castle. You are looking at a tomb, a monument to the day Vlad destroyed the old order and replaced it with a meritocracy of terror. He had cleansed his own house. Now he was ready to face the world. The year is 1459. The Ottoman Empire, sensing the growing insolence of this vassal prince, sent envoys to Targovishte. Their demand was standard, the annual tribute of golden boys for the Janissary Corps, but Vlad was done paying. When the envoys entered the throne room, they kept their turbans on their heads. In Ottoman culture, this was a sign of religious piety. They removed their headgear for no man, only for God. Vlad, sitting in the shadows of his throne, asked them why they insulted him in his own house. They explained their custom. They spoke of their law. And here we see the twisted genius of Vlad's diplomacy. He did not fly into a rage. He smiled. He spoke softly. "I have no wish to make you break your customs," he said. "In fact, I shall assist you in strengthening them, so that you may never take them off again." He ordered his guards to seize the men. The description of what followed is clinical, and it requires us to wince even 5 centuries later. Small iron nails were brought forward. The envoys were held down, screaming pleas that fell on deaf ears. The nails were driven directly through the fabric of the turbans and into the skulls beneath. Whatever medical knowledge Vlad had possessed, he applied it here. He avoided the brain's fatal centers just enough to ensure they did not die immediately. He wanted them alive. He wanted them to ride back to Constantinople with the iron still embedded in their heads. Imagine the journey back, the infection setting in, the throbbing agony with every step of the horse. When these men, pale, feverish, and permanently disfigured, collapsed at the feet of Sultan Mehmed II. The message was undeniable. This was not just a refusal to pay taxes. This was a desecration. Mehmed II was the conqueror of Constantinople. He was a man who believed himself to be the shadow of God on earth. To treat his messengers with such intimate violence was to slap the face of the prophet himself. War was no longer a possibility. It was an inevitability. The Sultan gathered an army that the chroniclers claim drank rivers dry. Over 60,000 men, some say 90,000. Cannons that could shatter city walls. Elite janissaries who had never known defeat. They marched toward Wallachia, expecting to crush a rebellious insect. Instead, they were marching into a psychological abattoir. Vlad knew he could not defeat them with steel, so he prepared to defeat them with the night. As the massive Ottoman army crossed the Danube, they expected a battlefield. They found a wasteland. Vlad knew he could not stand toe-to-toe with the janissaries, so he weaponized nature itself against them. He evacuated entire villages and driving his own people into the safety of the mountains. He burned the fields that were ready for harvest. He poisoned the wells with animal carcasses and lime. Imagine marching for weeks under the blistering Balkan sun. Your throat is parched, but you dare not drink from the streams. Your stomach is empty, but the fields are black with ash. And the silence is broken only by the buzzing of flies. But the silence was a lie. Vlad unleashed a campaign of psychological erosion. His light cavalry, swift and ghostly, would strike the Ottoman flanks in the twilight, kill a dozen men, and vanish before the alarm could be raised. Sleep became impossible. Every shadow held a knife. Every rustle of leaves was a potential ambush. The Ottoman soldiers, the bravest in the world, began to fray. They were fighting a phantom, but on the night of June 17th, 1462, the phantom became flesh. It was past midnight. The moon was obscured by thick clouds. The Ottoman camp, a sprawling city of tents housing 60,000 souls, was asleep. Suddenly, the darkness erupted. Vlad, personally leading a force of perhaps 7,000 men, stormed the camp. They did not come to conquer. They came to assassinate. They carried torches and blew horns, creating the illusion of a force 10 times their size. The chaos was absolute. In the confusion, Ottoman soldiers, disoriented and terrified, began fighting each other. Brother killed brother in the frantic search for an enemy who moved like smoke. Vlad's objective was singular. He was cutting a path of blood straight toward the Sultan's pavilion. He wanted to cut the head off the snake. Historians debate how close he came. Some say he was within spear-throwing distance of Mehmed's tent. Others say he mistook the tent of the Grand Vizier for the Sultan's. But the result was the same. He struck. He terrified. And before the sun rose, he disappeared back into the forests, leaving thousands of Ottoman dead behind him. The Sultan survived, but his confidence was shaken. He had never faced a man who would dare to dive into the throat of the beast simply to rip out its tongue. However, Mehmed pressed on. He was determined to reach the capital, Târgoviște, and end this nightmare. He believed that capturing the capital would signify victory. He was wrong. The capital was not the prize. It was the canvas for Vlad's masterpiece. We must pause here. We must prepare ourselves for what Mehmed saw, because no description in the annals of warfare compares to the sight that awaited the Ottoman army outside Târgoviște. It started with the smell. Long before they saw the city, the wind carried a scent that made veteran soldiers, men who had waded through blood at Constantinople, gag and vomit. It was the thick, sweet, cloying odor of decay, baked by the summer heat. Then they crested the hill. The Greek historian Leonikos Chalkokondyles, the only man whose words can truly capture this horror, wrote that the army entered a forest that stretched for nearly 3 kilometers. 20,000 bodies, men, women, children, Ottoman prisoners taken in previous raids, Bulgarian sympathizers, traitors, all of them lifted high into the air on wooden stakes. But it was the arrangement that shattered the Sultan's mind. This was not a heap of corpses. It was a geometric display of total control. The stakes were arranged in concentric circles in perfect rows. The height of the stake corresponded to the rank of the victim. At the center, elevated above all others, was the rotting corpse of Hamza Pasha, the envoy who had once tried to capture Vlad. He was still wearing his silk robes, now tattered and stained, serving as a grim centerpiece to this garden of hell. And the silence. There were no birds. Even the vultures, gorged on too much flesh, sat heavy and motionless on the stakes. The only sound was the wind whistling through the rib cages of the long dead, and the faint, rhythmic flapping of tattered clothing. Sultan Mehmed II, the conqueror, the man who had brought the Roman Empire to its end, stopped his horse. He stared. He did not order an attack. He could not. According to the chronicles, he took off his turban, wiped his brow, and uttered words that sounded like a surrender of the soul. I cannot take the land of a man who does such great things, and who knows how to use his power and his subjects in this way. A man who has done this is worth much. It was a compliment. It was a confession of horror. Mehmed realized that he was not fighting a general. He was fighting a force of nature that had abandoned all human limits. To defeat Vlad, he would have to sacrifice more than just soldiers. He would have to sacrifice his own sanity. So, the most powerful army on earth turned around. They did not retreat because they were beaten in battle. They retreated because they were broken in spirit. Vlad the Impaler had won. He had saved his country not with a larger army, but with 20,000 stakes. But here is the cruelest lesson of history. Winning the war does not mean you survive the peace. The Ottomans had retreated. Europe was saved. The church bells rang in celebration of the champion of Christ. But in the shadows, the knives were coming out, and this time they were not held by Turks, but by Christians. Vlad had made a fatal miscalculation. He believed that his results would justify his methods. He believed that because he had stopped the Ottoman advance, his allies would tolerate his brutality. He was wrong. King Matthias Corvinus of Hungary, the man who was supposed to be Vlad's greatest ally, looked at the Prince of Wallachia and saw a liability. Vlad was too independent, too unpredictable, and, frankly, too terrifying. Furthermore, Matthias had received massive funds from the Pope to fight a crusade, funds he had spent on other things. He needed a scapegoat. He needed a reason to explain why the crusade wasn't happening. So, history witnessed one of its greatest acts of betrayal. It wasn't a sword that brought Vlad down. It was a forgery. Matthias produced a letter, a clumsy fake, written in a style Vlad never used, addressed to the Sultan. The letter claimed that Vlad was offering to turn Wallachia over to the Ottomans in exchange for power. It was a lie so transparent that a child could see through it. But in politics, truth is irrelevant. Convenience is king. In November 1462, mere months after his legendary victory at the Forest of the Impaled, Vlad was arrested by his own allies. He was dragged in chains, not to a throne, but to a dungeon in Visegrad. He would spend the next 12 years in captivity, and it is here, in the solitude of a Hungarian prison, that we catch a final, chilling glimpse of his pathology. The Russian narrations of the time tell us that even in his cell, stripped of all power, Vlad could not stop being who he was. He would capture mice and birds that flew into his window. He would whittle small splinters of wood from his furniture, and there, in the dark, alone, he would impale the creatures on miniature stakes. He would arrange them in rows. It is a detail that freezes the blood. It proves that the impalement was not just a military strategy, as we might hope. It was a compulsion. It was the only way he knew how to interact with the world. He had to control. He had to dominate. Even if his kingdom was reduced to a few square feet of stone floor and a handful of dead rats. In 1476, the political winds shifted again. A new threat emerged, and suddenly, the monster was needed once more. Matthias released him. Vlad, now in his mid-40s, his face lined with years of bitterness, returned to Wallachia. The dragon had returned. But the world had moved on. His third reign lasted barely 2 months. The exact details of his death are lost in the fog of war. Some say he fell in battle against the Ottomans near Bucharest. Others say he was assassinated by a Wallachian rival. And there is a darker theory, one that says his own men, terrified that his return meant the return of the stakes, struck him down from behind in the confusion of the fight. But we know what happened to his body. The Ottomans, who had feared him for decades, needed proof. They needed to know the nightmare was truly over. His head was severed. It was preserved in a jar of honey to stop the rot, a sweet shroud for a bitter man, and sent to Constantinople. There, it was displayed on a high stake in the center of the city. The crowds gathered. They stared at the face that had haunted their dreams. The man who had impaled 20,000 of their brothers was finally just a piece of meat. His body was reportedly buried at the Snagov Monastery, on a lonely island in the middle of a lake. For centuries, monks prayed over the stone slab, but in 1933, archaeologists opened the tomb. They lifted the heavy stone, expecting to find the skeleton of the prince, perhaps clad in the remnants of his armor. They found nothing. The tomb was empty. Only a few horse bones and some pottery fragments remained. Where is he? Did loyal monks move his body to protect it from desecration? Was he never buried there at all? Or is the answer something more unsettling? This mystery, of course, fed the fire of the Dracula legend. Bram Stoker, writing 400 years later, would take the name and the cruelty of Vlad and mix it with the folklore of the vampire. But in doing so, I believe Stoker did history a disservice. By turning Vlad into a supernatural monster teats, a creature of magic and fangs, we make him safe. We can tell ourselves that he is fiction, that such evil does not exist in the real world. But Vlad was not a vampire. He did not drink blood for sustenance. He spilled it for power. So, as we stand at the edge of this story, looking back at the forest of stakes, what is the true horror of Vlad the Impaler? It is not that he was a monster. It is that he was a product of his time, a perfect reflection of the world that created him. He was a child hostage, taught by an empire that ruled through fear. He was a prince betrayed by his own nobility. He was a general abandoned by his allies. He learned early that in a world of wolves, the only way to survive is to become the beast that the wolves fear. His methods were undeniably atrocious. But here is the question that should haunt you tonight. If his methods were madness, why did they work? Why did the greatest empire on earth turn back? Why did crime in Wallachia virtually disappear during his reign? Why do we, 500 years later, still remember his name when 1,000 other kings are forgotten? Perhaps the real horror isn't what Vlad did to the bodies of his enemies. It is the uncomfortable truth that deep down, in the darkest recesses of the human collective unconscious, we respect the efficacy of terror. We are drawn to the absolute. Vlad Dracula showed us the limit of human cruelty, and he forced us to look at it. He forced us to realize that civilization is just a thin veneer, and underneath, there are only the stakes, waiting to be sharpened. The forest is gone now. The bodies have turned to dust. But the lesson remains. And sometimes, in the dead of night, if you listen closely to the winds blowing through the Carpathian Mountains, you can still hear the silence of the 20,000,